January 1870, the high valley of the Roaring Fork, Colorado Territory. The air was not air. It was a fine, crystalline dust of ice that abraded the lungs. The wind did not howl. It was a deep, resonant pressure that made the 12-inch thick spruce logs of the cabin groan like a ship in a heavy sea. Inside, Elias Thorne was awake, as he had been most of the night. He was 34 years old, a trapper who had come west from the rolling, damp hills of Ohio, and he was colder than he had ever been in his life. He was inside his cabin, buried under 2 buffalo robes and a wool blanket, and he was shivering so hard his teeth ached. The stove in the corner, a small cast-iron box he had hauled by mule for 60 miles, was roaring. It was cherry red in the gloom. Devouring the split pine, he fed it. But the heat it produced was a fleeting, desperate thing. It rose, struck the frozen planks of the roof, and vanished. The cabin itself was a machine for attracting the cold. Elias watched his own breath cloud in front of his face, a pale plume in the half-light. He slid from the bunk, his moccasined feet landing on a floor so cold it felt wet. The water bucket, sitting not 6 feet from the glowing stove, was frozen solid. He walked to the west wall, the one taking the brunt of the wind. A fine, glittering frost covered the logs from floor to ceiling. Not on the outside, on the inside. He pressed his palm against the wood. It was like touching an anvil left out in the snow, a dead, thieving cold that sucked the warmth from his hand instantly. This was the failure. He had spent the entire previous summer building this place, following the exact wisdom he had been taught. He used the biggest, straightest lodgepole pines he could find. He had notched them with a perfect saddle notch, tight as a drum. He had chinked the gaps with the best clay from the creek bed, mixed with dried grass. It was, by all accounts, a perfect cabin. And it was going to kill him. It wasn't just the discomfort, it was the math. To stay alive, to keep the cabin just above freezing, he was burning a mountain of firewood. He was spending all his daylight hours felling, bucking and splitting just to feed the stove. He had no time to check his trap lines. He had no time to hunt. The cabin, built for shelter, had become his prison. The structure itself was the enemy. He looked at his father's broadaxe resting by the door, its 12-inch blade gleaming faintly. It was a tool for building. He realized with a deep and frightening clarity that he had built the wrong thing. This structure did not understand the altitude. It did not understand a wind that came from the Arctic and did not stop for 1,000 miles. It was a low-country design in a high-country world, and he would have to change, or he would not see the spring. The memory of the build was still sharp, a fresh scar of labor on his muscles. He had chosen the site in the spring of 1869, a small, flat bench above the creek, sheltered by a stand of aspen. It was beautiful. It was also, he now realized, perfectly placed in a natural wind tunnel. He had begun the work with pride. He was building his fortress, the way his grandfather had in Ohio. He felled over 60 mature lodgepole pines, limbing them where they fell, dragging them to the site with his long-suffering mule, Silas. The work was brutal, rhythmic and satisfying. Each thud of his axe, each clean shear of the wood, felt like a victory. He was a strong man, and he knew his craft. He measured and cut every notch by hand. He had heard of trappers building shoddy, fast cabins with huge, sloppy gaps that required a wagon-load of daubing. Not him. His notches were so tight he barely needed chinking at all. But he did it anyway, packing the thin gaps between the round logs with a stiff mixture of grey clay and straw. It was the standard way. It was the only way he knew. The structure rose through the summer, a testament to his strength, solid 12-inch thick walls, a strong ridgepole, a roof of split log planks covered in thick sod. When he drove the last peg, he had stepped back and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It was the biggest, tightest cabin in the valley, and it had failed utterly. The failure wasn't sudden. It was a slow, creeping invasion. The first frost in September revealed the flaws. The massive green logs had begun to cure in the dry, high-altitude air, and as they dried, they shrank. The tight saddle notches loosened. The inflexible clay chinking, which had dried to the hardness of brick, did not shrink with the wood. It cracked, it powdered. In places it simply fell out, leaving half-inch gaps straight to the outside. The wind found those gaps instantly. At first they were just whistles. By November they were shrieks. Elias spent his days re-chinking, but it was a losing battle. The true enemy, however, was not the gaps. It was the logs themselves. In Ohio, a 12-inch log wall was a formidable barrier against a damp 20-degree night. Here, at 9,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks. The cold saturated the dense, solid wood, and the logs became a thermal bridge. They were no longer insulation, they were conductors. The stove could not fight the sheer, radiating cold of 4 massive frozen walls. He was living inside a perfectly built 30-ton block of ice. He tried everything. He nailed his spare canvas tarps against the north wall. The wind tore them to shreds in a night. He banked snow as high as he could against the outside. It helped, but he couldn't bank it to the roof. He even tried building a massive fire in the hearth, ignoring his stove, thinking the radiant heat would dry out the logs. It only succeeded in setting the chimney-lining clay on fire and filling the cabin with smoke, forcing him to stumble out into the sub-zero night, choking, his face freezing, while he beat out the embers. He sat by the dying stove, defeated, rubbing his raw hands. "If everyone builds this way," he whispered to the frozen walls, "how does anyone live?" The answer came back in a gust of snow that puffed through a crack near the floor. They didn't. Not here. The standard way was wrong. The realization forced him to move. He could not survive the rest of the winter trapped in the cabin. He packed a week's worth of food, strapped on his snowshoes, and made the grueling 2-day trek down the valley to the trading post at Three Forks. It was a collection of rough-sawn buildings, usually bustling, but now hunkered down and silent under a heavy blanket of snow. The post was run by a man named Fitzpatrick, but the man Elias sought was Niels Hauge. Hauge was a Norwegian, old, with a face like wind-carved rock, who had been trapping this high country for 30 years. He lived in a structure half dug into a hillside, a low, sprawling thing that looked more like a badger's den than a human habitation. Elias knocked on the thick plank door. Hauge opened it, and a cloud of warm, moist air, smelling of pipe tobacco and smoked meat, rushed out. Elias, stunned, was pulled inside. The interior was small, dark, and overwhelmingly warm. The stove was a tiny thing, barely larger than Elias's, and it was burning at a lazy, quiet pace. The walls were not round logs. They were thick, squared-off timbers, and they were warm to the touch. Elias, stamping snow from his boots, couldn't hide his astonishment. "Niels! How? My cabin is an ice house. I'm burning a cord of wood a week just to keep my water from freezing solid." Niels Hauge packed his pipe, his blue eyes twinkling in the lamplight. He gestured with his chin to the wall. "You build like a lowlander, Thorn. You build a house to look good. You build one wall. One wall is for wind. One wall is for cold. They are not the same thing. He tapped the thick timber wall. This is not one wall, it is two. He led Elias to a corner where a section of planking was loose. He pulled it away. Elias peered into the gap, holding his lantern close. He saw the outer wall, made of thick 6-inch squared cants. Then he saw the inner wall, made of similar cants, and the 18-inch space between them was packed, solid, with a dry, fluffy mixture of sawdust and dried moss. "The wood is just the box," Niels said, tapping his pipe on the stove. "The fill mass, the filling. That is the wall. The cold freezes the outside box, but it cannot jump the air in the moss. It cannot steal the heat from the inside box." Elias was transfixed. It was so simple and so revolutionary. He had heard of filled wall construction, but it was dismissed as a crude immigrant trick. Now he saw it was genius. Niels wasn't done. He pointed up. "And your roof? You have a roof, ja. But do you have a tackstall? A ceiling?" He pointed to his own low ceiling of thick planks. "Above this is 3 feet of sod, yes. But on these planks, before the sod, is 2 feet of the same, moss and sawdust. Heat goes up. You must stop it." Elias thought of his own cabin, where the heat rushed straight up to the frozen, sod-covered planks. He wasn't just heating his cabin. He was heating the sky. He spent the night in Niels's burrow, sleeping in a warmth so profound it felt like a sickness. He listened to the Arctic wind roar over the mound of earth above him, and he felt nothing but a deep, comforting silence. He was learning from an old master, but he also remembered his own observations. He'd seen a ptarmigan dive headfirst into a snowdrift to escape the wind. It wasn't the snow that kept it warm. It was the trapped air in the snow. Niels' wall was a permanent, stable snowdrift. He returned to his own cabin 2 days later. He looked at the frost-covered walls, at the hungry stove, at the woodpile that represented his life's blood. He picked up his father's broadaxe. He swung it, not in anger, but with purpose, sinking the blade deep into the log wall he had built with such misplaced pride. The sound was a dull, frozen thunk. He would not just patch the cabin. He would tear it down to the last log and rebuild it from the foundation up. The spring of 1870 was a frantic race against time. Elias could not afford another winter of failure. He began by dismantling his prison. The work was heartbreaking. Every log he had, so carefully notched and hoisted, he now had to pry apart and roll aside. He saved every piece, numbering them. But he was not just rebuilding, he was re-engineering. His first act was the foundation. His original cabin had been built on sill logs, laid directly on leveled earth. This was a massive mistake. The frozen ground leached heat directly from the floor. This time, he spent 3 weeks hauling and dry stacking flat river stones, building a 2-foot-high plinth, a solid, dry foundation that would lift his new structure completely off the ground, separating it from the earth's cold. Then, the walls. This was where the broadaxe became the key. He would not use round logs. Round logs created V-shaped gaps that demanded chinking, and chinking always failed. Following Niels's design, he would build 2 parallel walls of squared timbers. He dragged his old logs onto 2 sawhorses. He snapped a chalk line, and then the real work began. He took up his father's broadaxe. This was not chopping, this was hewing. He stood over the log, swinging the heavy, wide blade in a precise shaving motion, slicing off the round sides, leaving a flat, 6-inch thick cant. It was agonizing, skilled labor. Swing, slice, chips flew. His shoulders burned. He worked from dawn until dusk, turning his pile of round logs into a neat stack of squared timbers. His neighbors, the few other settlers in the valley, rode by and watched. They saw him building what looked like two small, flimsy walls, spaced 2 feet apart. "What's this, Thorn?" "No," asked Jedediah, the man from the next homestead. "Building a cabin for your cabin." Elias just wiped the sweat from his eyes. "Building one for the wind," he said, "and one for me." He erected the outer wall first, a 6-inch thick shell. Then he built the inner wall, leaving a 2-foot gap between them. He timber-framed the corners for strength, creating a series of massive 2-foot square boxes or channels that formed the perimeter of his house. This time there was no chinking. The flat-faced cants sat almost perfectly on top of one another. Before he built the walls too high, he had to prepare the fill mass. He spent days in the woods, not with his axe, but with a rake and a burlap sack. He found vast, dry carpets of sphagnum moss under the pines. He gathered it, dried it in the sun, and piled it into a mountain of fluffy, lightweight insulation. He combined this with the sawdust from his hewing and sawing. This was his natural insulation panel. The construction became a careful, layered process. He would build the inner and outer walls up by 3 feet. Then he would climb into the 2-foot cavity with baskets of his moss and sawdust mix. He packed it down, tamping it with a heavy stick, ensuring there were no air pockets, no gaps for the cold to find. It was dusty, tedious, and slow. The cabin rose not as a stack of logs, but as a composite 3-layered assembly, an outer timber shell, a 2-foot thick core of insulation, and an inner timber shell. The walls grew to be monstrously thick. When he framed the windows, the openings were so deep they looked like fortress embrasures. His old windows, which had been sheets of ice, were now set deep inside a 30-inch thick wall. He built the door himself, a sandwich of 2 thick planks, with a 4-inch core packed with raw wool he'd traded for. It hung on massive iron hinges and closed with the solid, final thump of a bank vault. The roof was the final masterpiece. He laid a ceiling of thick planks over the main room, creating a low, 8-foot-high living space. This created a new, large attic. Before he put the exterior roof on, he spent a week hauling buckets of his insulation mix into that attic, spreading it, packing it, until he had a 3-foot-thick blanket of moss and sawdust covering the entire ceiling of the cabin. Only then did he build the rafters and lay the final sod roof. By the end of September, the structure was complete. It looked dense. It was not the graceful rustic cabin of a magazine illustration. It was a blockhouse. It was a fortress against the cold, built of timber, moss, and air. He lit the stove. The small cast-iron box, which had been so useless in the old cabin, now seemed to fill the room with a gentle, penetrating warmth. The air felt still. The silence was absolute. He looked at his broadaxe, its edge dulled from hewing hundreds of feet of timber. He had done the work. Now all he could do was wait for the test. The winter arrived not as a slow decline, but as an ambush. In the second week of November, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind, which had been toying with the valley, fell into a dead, terrifying calm. Elias checked his woodpile. He had half the wood he had gathered the previous year, a gamble that his design would pay off. He brought his mule into the small, attached shed. He checked the seal on his new door and shuttered the windows. That night the blizzard hit. It was a storm of Arctic proportions, a physical assault of wind and ice. The temperature plunged to 30 below zero, then 35 below. For 4 days, the world vanished into a white, screaming vortex. Elias was inside his fortress. The stove was lit, but he kept the damper almost closed. He was burning single, small logs, one at a time. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The 80-mile-per-hour wind, which had previously screamed through his walls, was now just a distant, muffled roar. It sounded like a river far away. There were no drafts, no knives of air, no curtains moving, no snow dust puffing through the cracks, because there were no cracks. The cabin was sealed. He waited for the cold to creep in, for the telltale frost to appear on the walls. It never came. He walked to the north wall, the one facing the full, relentless battery of the storm. He placed his bare hand on the inner, hewn log wall. It was not warm, but it was not cold. It was the temperature of the room. It felt like a piece of pine furniture. The 6-inch outer wall was undoubtedly frozen solid, a block of ice, but the 2-foot-thick barrier of moss and air had stopped the cold. It could not make the jump. The thermal bridge was broken. The natural insulation panel was working. He sat at his small table, drinking hot coffee. He was in his shirt sleeves. His water bucket in the corner had a thin skim of ice on it, but the water was liquid. He was comfortable. He was warm. The little stove, barely working, was more than enough to heat the 16 by 20-foot space. He was burning 1/4 of the wood he had before. On the 3rd night of the storm, he heard a sound. It was a desperate, frantic pounding on his thick new door. He unbarred it. A figure, completely encased in ice, fell inside. It was Jedediah, his neighbor. His face was pale, his beard a solid mass of ice. "Thorn," he gasped, his lungs heaving. My cabin, the roof, the wind, it took the sod. My stovepipe, it's full of snow." Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed his robes and snowshoes. He fought his way through the blizzard to Jedediah's cabin, a half-mile away. It was a scene from his own nightmares. The cabin was a cave of wind and snow. The stove was dead, the interior thick with smoke and drifting ice. Jed's wife and 2 small children were huddled under a bed, shivering violently, their faces gray. Elias carried the youngest child. Jed carried the other. They stumbled back to his fortress. When Jed's wife stepped inside, she stopped, her eyes wide, and began to weep. Not from fear, but from shock. "It's quiet," she whispered, looking at the calm, solid walls. It's warm." Elias Thorne barred the door against the howling storm, and for the first time in his new home, he felt the profound, unshakable relief of survival. His design had not just been proven, it had saved lives. When the storm broke, the valley was transformed. Jedediah's cabin was a ruin. His livestock frozen. He and his family had lost everything except their lives. They stayed with Elias for 2 weeks, and in that time Jedediah did nothing but stare at the walls. He ran his hands over the smooth, hewn logs. He tapped them. He asked Elias again and again to explain the principle. Elias showed him. He drew sketches in the frost on the window pane. He explained the wind wall, the living wall, and the fill mass that separated them. That spring, Elias did not trap. He and Jedediah, using Elias's broadaxe and his mules, rebuilt Jedediah's cabin. But they did not build it the old way. They built a thorn wall fortress, digging into the hillside as Niels Hauge had done, and filling the 2-foot cavity with moss, straw, and dried earth. The news of the storm and of Thorn's ark spread through the high country. Trappers, miners, and new homesteaders who had heard the story made pilgrimages to his cabin. They came to mock. They stayed to learn. Elias, a quiet man by nature, became an accidental teacher. He showed them how to square the logs. He explained that a thick wall was not the same as a warm wall. "The cold," he'd say, "is a thief. It will steal your heat through a solid log. You must build a wall it cannot cross. You must build a wall of air." The idea spread, and it adapted. Not everyone had the time or skill to hew two perfect walls. In the 1880s, as small sawmills appeared, settlers would build a standard round log cabin, then nail rough-sawn planks to the inside, creating a 6 or 8-inch gap. They would fill this cavity with sawdust from the mill, or sheep's wool, or even shredded newspaper. It was a faster, cheaper version of his design. They called it backplastering, or filling. In the lower valleys, it was a luxury. Above 8,000 feet, it became the definition of survival. A generation later, new arrivals to the Roaring Fork Valley found a unique architectural vernacular. The cabins were thick-walled, often dug into the earth, with deep-set windows and low ceilings. No one built single-wall structures anymore. It was simply the way it's done up here. The name Elias Thorn was mostly forgotten, but his innovation was everywhere. His hack had become common wisdom, a life-saving adaptation written into the very logs and foundations of the high country. What Elias Thorn had understood intuitively was a set of principles that building science would only formally name a century later. He had defeated his enemy, the cold, by mastering 3 distinct concepts. The first was conduction. He had learned firsthand that a solid, dense material, like a log, is a highway for temperature. His first cabin failed because the 30-degree cold on the outside conducted straight through the solid wood, turning his inner walls into giant frozen radiators. His new wall system solved this. The outer timber wall was the sacrificial layer. It could freeze solid, but that was all. The second and most important principle was insulation through trapped air. This was the genius of the fill mass. The 2-foot-thick layer of packed moss, sawdust, and grass was not itself a great insulator, but it was magnificent at trapping air. It created millions of microscopic dead air pockets. The cold could not jump from one particle of moss to the next. This is thermal resistance, or R value. A 12-inch solid log wall has an R value of about 12. Elias's 3-foot-thick composite wall, with its 2 feet of packed fill, likely had an R value over 40, a number that would be respectable in a brand-new home today. The third principle was thermal break. His old cabin was a single connected object. The new one was a system of disconnected layers. The outer wall and inner wall did not touch. The cold on the outside had no direct path to the inside. By separating the walls, he had created a buffer zone. The outer wall fought the wind, the inner wall held the heat, and the insulation in the middle mediated between them. He had done the same thing for the roof. His old cabin bled heat straight up. His new, heavily insulated ceiling stopped that heat, reflecting it back down into the room, allowing his tiny stove to work efficiently. His father's broadaxe, a tool from a simpler time, had been the key. It allowed him to turn round standard logs into flat, panel-like cants. He hadn't just built a cabin. He had fabricated a 19th-century on-site structural insulated panel. He had anticipated the core ideas of modern passive house design, not with a computer, but with an axe, a mule, and a desperate, observant intelligence. He had looked at a problem, respected the power of his environment, and adapted his traditions to meet it. Elias Thorne lived in his warm, quiet fortress for another 35 years. He watched the valley fill, watched a railroad snake through the canyon below, and watched his thick-walled building style become the signature of the region. He was known as a quiet, formidable man, one who had beaten the winter of 70. He knew he hadn't beaten anything. He had simply learned to listen. He had listened to the wind, he had listened to the wisdom of the Norwegian, and he had listened to the failure of his own pride. His broadaxe hung by the hearth, its handle worn smooth as riverstone, its blade sharp. It was a reminder that the right tool, used with new knowledge, could change everything. The cabin outlived him by decades. It became a line shack for a ranch, then a hunter's refuge, and finally a protected historical site. It stood as a silent testament, a lesson in wood and moss. The lesson was not just about insulation. It was about humility. It was about the willingness to see that the standard way is often just a starting point, and that true survival, true comfort, comes from adapting to the specific, brutal, and honest demands of a place. Elias Thorne's cabin showed that a structure is not just a shield against the world, it is a relationship with it. He had learned that you cannot fight a 40-degree wind. You must build in a way that makes the wind irrelevant. His neighbors saw 2 walls and a pile of dry moss. He saw a machine for living, a way to turn the hostile power of the climate into a simple, manageable fact. He proved that the most profound innovations are not always complex. Sometimes they are as simple as an empty space between 2 walls and the wisdom to know what to fill it with. It is a lesson that reminds us to observe, to adapt, and to question the common wisdom when it fails to keep us warm.